Hello, everyone. I'm so glad that you were able to make the talk today. I'm very excited to introduce my friend Jennifer Manley, who's a professor of neuropsychology in the Department of Neurology at Columbia University. I wanted Dr. Manley to talk with us because her research focuses on the mechanisms of inequality in cognitive aging and Alzheimer's disease. In order to do this research, her research team has partnered over a long number of years with the Black and Latinx communities in New York City and around the United States to design and carry out investigations of structural and social forces across the life course. Such as educational opportunities, racism, and discrimination and socioeconomic status. She's particularly interested in how these factors relate to cognition and brain health factors later in life. Her research has been funded by National Institute of Health and the Alzheimer's Association. She has authored over 220 peer-reviewed publications and 10 chapters. I think one of the things that she's particularly proud of, besides her incredible impact on these issues from a research standpoint, is that she has also been recognized for her amazing mentorship. She was the 2014 recipient of the Tony Wong Diversity Award for outstanding mentorship, and more recently was the recipient of the Satz-International Neuropsychological Society Career Mentoring Award in 2020. Maybe she can tell us how many students she's mentored. I have lost count. So at any rate, extremely impressive record and having a big impact on the future of neuropsychology, with many of her students becoming nationally known also in this area. Very importantly, besides the mentorship, is that Dr. Manley was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2021. This, as I think many of you know, is an incredible honor and one that relatively few psychologists have received. She also serves on the Advisory Council on Alzheimer's Research, Care, and Services until 2015, and is a member of the National Advisory Council on Aging. So let me stop talking so that we can hear Dr. Manley talk about the research that she has done. So thanks so much for coming, Jen. Appreciate it.
Oh, of course, and it's so nice to get introduced by you, Kathy, my good friend. So I'm assuming that everyone can see my screen right now.
Yes.
All right, awesome. So let me talk to you about kind of give you an overview of some of the drivers of our research, why we're doing research in this area, and some of the findings. I've got some new stuff in here that that we're working on now in our group. So I hope it will elicit some discussion, and I will finish on time. So first, let me thank the team. One of my close colleagues, Adam Brickman. We do a lot together. We merged our labs for mentorship purposes, and we have a joint lab meeting. And these are some pre-pandemic pictures of us getting together around this time of year to celebrate, and really everything that we have accomplished is due to these people. So thank you to them, and thank you to the funders of this work. And over the years, I've discovered that what I'm interested in is brain health equity. And this is essentially removing obstacles to health, such as poverty, discrimination, and their consequences, including powerlessness and lack of access to jobs with fair pay, and quality education and housing. And what this means to equalize opportunities, it means that those with worse health and fewer resources need more efforts expended to improve their health environments and their health care. And so this has become our intention among our research group, but also I think is really the intention of all people who are involved in health care and public health. When we ask really what can we do better to improve health across the board, we need to go back to the basics of attaining health equity. And with respect to dementia and cognitive impairment as people get older, the new questions, or the questions that we need to ask, are who and what forces and what power and money is driving the questions that we ask in our research, the populations we recruit, the evidence we get, and how we interpret that evidence. And so in these sort of blue bubbles down below, I've put different aspects of dementia prevention, but also diagnosis and recognition. And then finally, for people with cognitive impairment and dementia, access to care. And equity really plays a strong role in each of these aspects of the spectrum for cognitive impairment and dementia. My work is largely based, as Kathy mentioned, in the communities, and this is the community where these are the communities where we live and work, in Washington Heights, Inwood, and Harlem, in northern Manhattan. That's the George Washington Bridge, and the YCAP study that I've worked in for many, many years has been going since 1992, and includes over 6,500 adults who were chosen from lists of Medicare recipients, or Medicare eligible people, in the census tracts that surround the hospital, which has a little star here on the map, the Columbia University Irving Medical Center. And so these people who are enrolled in our longitudinal study are representative of the neighborhood, because they weren't chosen as people who were coming into the clinic with memory complaints. They were chosen because they live in the neighborhood and they're age 65 years and older, and they speak either Spanish or English, period. All of our testers and interviewers are bilingual, and we've been using a very similar neuropsych test battery and medical interview that we do in people's homes if they want to let us in there, which they do. And if they want to come into the clinic to do their evaluation, they can do that too. During the pandemic, obviously, we had to do a remote battery, so we call people over the phone. But this longitudinal study has been going on for a really long time, and it is the cohort really does map onto the census records in this neighborhood. And so it is largely people who identify as Hispanic or Latino, Latina, Latine, or Latinx. And they're mostly from the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. So this is not the same as New Mexico at all, but we have a whole different sort of diaspora here. Really interesting group of people who, there's a lot of back and forth, especially as people age. If they start to have physical or cognitive impairment, sometimes they move back to the Dominican Republic so that family can take care of them there. But we follow them longitudinally every 18 to 24 months doing the same battery or a follow-up battery. And as I was saying, about 30 to 35% of the cohort is Hispanic. The about 25 to 30% are non-Hispanic and Black, African American. Most of those are from the South, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia is where they were born, and they moved up to New York City for the Great Migration. And then we do have a lot of people who are not Hispanic and white too, in that age group. Many of them, English is their second language. They speak German and Polish and Hungarian at home. They're largely people who were Jewish, who escaped their countries during or right before World War II. We find one of the main findings of the YCAP study is that incident dementia is higher in the Latinx and non-Hispanic Black group. This is Mei Wing Watson, who's updating this result in our cohort. All of these people with this survival curve that you're seeing here, all of these people are at their baseline visit were not impaired in their function or in their cognition, but developed dementia over the follow-up. So these are incident cases. And we see higher incidence in those groups. And this has been a result that's been out there for quite some time in our study and others. And I just wanted to show this study from Northern California. This is Elizabeth Rose Maeda, who replicated essentially that type of study, but with the Kaiser Permanente Northern California healthcare data. These are all people 60 years and older, and she compared the ethnic and racial groups for incident cases of dementia using ICD-9 codes, and found that Asian Americans were least likely to develop dementia, and therefore set as the reference group in this study. But African Americans were 65% more likely to develop dementia than Asian Americans. And the American Indian Alaska Native group in Northern California were 32% more likely than Asian Americans to develop dementia. So it's not just Northern California where we're finding these results. One thing that I want to point out is that there is evidence for a survival effect or an age at leveler effect. This is Laura Zahodny, who was proudly one of my mentees. She was a postdoc in our lab, and now she's I think she's tenured now. I don't know if she knows. Yeah, no, she knows. At University of Michigan, she looked at the MIDA study, which is a midlife study, and also the YCAP study, just splitting the age groups in half for each of those studies. So now in YCAP, we have old who are 75 years and older, and young old who are younger than 75. And you can see that the Black-white disparities in memory score are wider at the younger ages. You can see that in YCAP over here, wider at younger ages than in older ages. And you can see that in MIDAS, that the disparity between Black people who are down here in the hashed line and the white people who are here in the solid line in terms of their memory score is wider at the younger ages than it is at the older ages. And so what we're seeing is that the people who live longer in both of these studies to be old or in old midlife in the Black group are hardier than they are in the white group. So this is just a side effect of having different survival times or different lifespans across groups. And so once we hit older age, we're seeing a narrowing of disparities that are even wider earlier in age. And so that is one of the challenges for our work is survival bias for any epidemiologic studies. But for clinic-based studies, we really have another major source of bias, which is selection bias. And that is that if you go to any specialized clinic, even primary care, the proportion of Black people and Hispanic people who have been formally diagnosed with dementia is pretty low. And this is work from the Health and Retirement Study, which is a population-based cohort that shows that overall, Alzheimer's disease is underdiagnosed in all groups. Only about half of the people who have Alzheimer's disease ever receive a formal diagnosis. But those misdiagnoses are more common among Black and Hispanic older adults than among older whites. And so the point here is that just as health advocates, we should be doing that, advocating for all people with dementia, not just the people who are diagnosed with dementia. And so as Alzheimer's disease researchers, that means we need to think very carefully about our research design. Here is Casey Dieters, who looked at the A4 trial, which was a trial looking at an amyloid busting drug. and people had to first qualify for that study by doing a PET scan and also a set of neuropsychological tests. I'm going to just summarize this really excellent figure that she has in the supplement section of her paper in 2021. But essentially, people, Black people who were willing to be in the A4 trial were differentially excluded at 2 time points. First, their test scores were, that they needed to be at a certain level in order to get into the study. Their test scores were too low, beyond the cutoff that was set for the trial. And so they were differentially excluded from that. And then of those people whose test scores were high enough to be in the study, those people, those Black people, did not have as much amyloid on their amyloid scans as they required to be in the study than as compared to the white people. So they were excluded, more likely to be excluded at those 2 time points. And so, some of the problems with the A4 trials that we don't have equivalent data for those who've sort of failed those screens. And we have limited specificity of recruitment data collected at each stage. So we can't draw super strong inferences regarding the relative contribution of these distinct enrollment-based factors, but sort of the selection biases and the test performance issues are something that we've known about for quite some time. And that definitely affects our ability to recruit people into research. So I think that, I've shown you some evidence that there are inequalities in cognitive impairment and dementia over populations, but also that we have some real methodological challenges to take care of, especially when we are relying on clinics to recruit people into research or to base all of our sort of what we think we know about Alzheimer's disease. And I think that we've gotten to this point where we are right now with Alzheimer's disease research by centering whiteness in our research. As we know, some of the early days of when Alzheimer's disease criteria were formed in the 1980s, that research focused in and it was in newly established Alzheimer's disease research centers. The idea behind Alzheimer's disease research centers was that they would be local hubs of expertise. But those ADRCs were located in institutions that serve primarily white people and still are actually. The scientists were all coming from majority backgrounds, and the studies were really only accessible to white people because of the way that they were set up. And I think I've shown you an example of how that's really continued on to this day with respect to the criteria for getting into studies. And I think what that means is that what we know about Alzheimer's disease largely it lacks generalizability to the rest of the world, and risks conflating factors of the disease with features of the population, which overwhelmingly, if you look at Alzheimer's disease research, are white and privileged. And so now you risk baking in the features of that very narrow, non-representative phenotype into what you think you know about the disease. And I think that's why we need to move forward. I want to show you just a couple studies. I love this one. I hope you all read it. In NAC, which is the collaborative study or collaborative data set for all of the ADRCs. What Carrie Gleason did was essentially she found that the way that Black people and white people were enrolled into these studies can explain differences in the trajectory of cognitive function in the groups that are enrolled in those studies. So in part, research centers have to feel that they have to do a different type of recruitment because for different populations, because there's less trust in the medical system and less access among minoritized populations. And so these different enrollment approaches then change more than just the race and ethnicity of the people in the study. It changes everything about what we should expect from them moving forward. And so differences that are attributed to race in these studies are not necessarily about race or ethnicity. They're about the way that they were enrolled and sort of the population or subpopulation that they're coming from. I also like this study, Giantasio compared a community-based study, which is ERIC, and a clinic-based study, which is ADNI. And she found that a substantial portion of the estimated associations differed, including the ones shown here in the imaging subsamples, where, for example, amyloid burden had a much stronger relationship to cognitive outcomes in ADNI. Race and ethnicity had a smaller effect on outcomes in ADNI. And the ApoE4 allele had a weaker relationship to amyloid burden in ERIC. So studies like this show that even if the associations are unbiased within a sample, the inferences based on highly selected clinical samples may not be relevant to the broader population. A good example, I think, of this, again, is seen in our YCAP cohort. You've probably seen a lot of studies recently that suggest that tau is higher in Black people that have Alzheimer's disease or that have cognitive impairment. But we don't find that in YCAP, the YCAP study. These are plasma levels of tau, amyloid, and NFL, and are essentially equivalent across the total sample, the white people and the Black people in our sample, and the Hispanic people. And the other thing for you to see is that in the community-based sample, the ROC curves, this is predicting clinical diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. The ROC curves are really crappy for these plasma-based measures. And so it's far from impressive, but we are finding really nice I think really nicely that these more population accessible plasma-based biomarkers are a critical component for us to understand the burden of neuropathology in disparities populations. So again, we're working from a framework for health equity, and I just want to point out that what we normally see in the clinic is just the tip of the iceberg, and that if you look at models for health equity, we see that the things that drive health inequalities have root causes that are historical. They are institutional and structural. They involve exploitation and discrimination that lead to imbalances in institutional power and wealth, inequalities in labor markets, in housing policy, in education, social safety net, social networks, and tax policy. And these imbalances then influence what we would normally call social determinants of health. So when we measure an individual's neighborhood and individual's working conditions, we also have to keep in mind that there are structural sort of societal level factors that drive those. That in fact, those social determinants of health themselves are downstream, and that genetic factors have to be contextualized within the broader set of factors that contribute to health and those that are driven by systemic racism. So let me start showing you some of the evidence we have for these structural and social determinants on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. This is Adam Brickman, who I talked about before, and he found in the YCAP cohort that when he looked at white matter hyperintensities among those people who we saw in MRI scans, that there was an inequality according to self-reported race and ethnicity The white people in our sample overall had lower white matter hyperintensities. They're the black line here. And then the Latinx and African American people had higher levels of white matter hyperintensity. One thing just to note is that our scans started more or less when people were age 70. And so they're really older by this point, and that there's no interaction here between age and race. So we realized, that we were missing this inflection point when people who are not born with white matter hyperintensities, but that there's an inequality in the development of those, the acceleration of development of those. So we thought we needed to get younger in age. This is one piece of evidence that we used to try to get younger in age with our cohorts. And so in looking at white matter hyperintensities using his quantification methods, Laura Zahodny later on related those white matter hyperintensities to cognition. There was not a reliable relationship between cognitive function and white matter hyperintensities in the white people in YCAP, but it was related to cognition in the African Americans. So the more white matter hyperintensities, the lower your score on cognition for the Black people in our study. In contrast, when we quantified hippocampal volume, this is also Laura Zahodny's work, people who were white with lower hippocampal volume were more likely to develop dementia at a subsequent visit for YCAP, but that was not the case among the Black people in our sample. And so there's something going on here with historical sources and contemporary sources of racism and structural racism that we're reflecting using our self-reported race groupings here that change the sort of neuroimaging biomarkers relationship to future cognitive decline. This is Indira Turney, one of the postdocs in our group, one of the people that Kathy mentioned among many I'll be showing I'm super proud of. This paper just came out a couple weeks ago. She found, and she's using the offspring cohort. So we, in 2016, got a study to collect data on midlife people, midlife adults who are the adult children of the YCAP cohorts. And we did that in part because of that slide I showed you a couple ones back, where we had sort of missed the action for the development of white matter hyperintensities in these groups, and we needed to get earlier in age. So now we have a group of people, the offspring, whose mean age at scan is about 55 years, and the YCAP people, their mean age at scan was about 76 years. And disturbingly, what Indira found was that the Black people in offspring have almost as many white matter hyperintensities as their parents do, even though they're 20 some years younger. And that's not true among the white people and less true in the Latinx people in our sample. And then when she looks at the relationship, these are all cross-sectional studies. So this is not people followed over time with their imaging, but if you look at the slope of the scans in the offspring study for the younger cohort, the offspring cohort, and for the older cohort, the YCAP cohort, you can see this inflection point of an acceleration of the white matter hyperintensities in the older ages. And we saw that in the white people and the Latinx people, but in the Black participants, there was really not an inflection point. The relationship of age to white matter hyperintensities is exactly the same in the offspring and in the And in the older adults, the YCAP cohort, we saw something very similar in looking at cortical thickness. So it's not just white matter hyperintensity. So there's something about these experiences of Black people that we're diving more into in terms of their risk for some of these early biomarkers for cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. And I use this study a lot because it is really important to a good example of how racially patterned life course social factors are found to influence inequalities in dementia. And I'm going to talk about place of birth first. This study looked at death certificates from every state in the US. The states with darker colors have a higher prevalence of dementia listed as a contributing cause of death. And overall, Black people who are on the left side here, both of the left side maps, and white people who are on the right side maps, overall, Black people were more likely to have dementia than whites, listed as a cause of death. But regardless of race, stroke belt states were associated with higher risk of dementia. So stroke belt being these states down here. It's important to note that the state that Maria Gleamore used in this study is not state of death. It is state of birth. So the people in this study moved around. Many of the Black people migrated north. And so what this study shows is that in terms of dementia, you take your childhood risk with you. And this has been found in other diseases like stroke. So this is not unusual. Paula Gilsands in that Kaiser Northern California cohort found that in people who were enrolled in that healthcare system, people who were born in the stroke belt states were at higher risk for dementia, even though they lived most of their adult lives in the Bay Area. So you can see here are the high stroke mortality states that she looked at, and that these participants had lived in Northern California for over 23 years. That's kind of how you get into the Kaiser healthcare system, is that you live and work there. We've been asking ourselves, what is it about these stroke belt states that's putting folks at higher risk, in order to inform maybe some potential points of intervention to reduce risk for later life cognitive impairment on a population level. And one of the really interesting things that I've been narrowing in on is educational experience. And I really like this study. I took the slide from Maria Gleamore, but this is a study in Europe. It shows that early life educational policies have an impact on cognitive function later in life. And this was shown in the ELSA study as a function of a 1947 school reform that raised the minimum age of leaving school in the UK, and also a measure of executive function that was given in this study that enrolled people who are 65 years and older. And what they found that for men and for women, and this is their birth year, so that they were either subject or not subject to that 1947 school reform, that using this regression discontinuity design, there was like a different trajectory for people who were and were not subject to the law. Yet Vonk, who is another one of the postdocs that I'm really proud of, she's now a faculty member at UCSF, found in the YCAP cohort something very similar with these secular changes. So this is looking at change in memory performance over time. And essentially there was a benefit of being born later. The people who were born later had a less rapid decline in their memory in the YCAP study than the people who were born earlier. And when she looked at some of the social and structural data that we had on these people, she found that these differences were almost entirely due to policy changes in educational attainment and educational quality. And so data like this, all these people, by the way, were studied at the same age. So I always forget to make that point. People are like, well, yeah, people who were born later or younger, duh, they have different slopes. No, we actually studied them at the same exact age. And we were able to do that because we have different recruitment cohorts in YCAP. And we have the same, essentially equated them on follow-up time and age at entry. So that's why we think that this study shows really nicely more of a causal link between educational policy and Alzheimer's disease risk. I've also been doing this work in the REGARD study, which is a national study of stroke. I showed you some data that also is using national data earlier, but because they collected residential history, so every place you've ever lived in REGARDS, which is a study that oversampled Black people overall and oversampled people in the stroke belt, and then measured cognition over the phone since about 15 years ago longitudinally. Me and Maria Gleamore, use the fact that there were policy changes in each state and each year to look at the relationship between some of these educational policies and later life cognitive function. And so we used some of these biennial surveys on education to look up data at the county level and the state level for length of school year, student-teacher ratio, and percent attendance. And you can see here that the school year was much, much longer if you were living in a northern state in general, and also much longer if you lived in the South, if you were a white person who attended white segregated schools, as opposed to people who were in Black schools. And then this is elementary level student teacher ratio that Black people in South Carolina is as an example, who were in schools in the 1930s, were sharing their classroom with 40, 50 other children. And this was not the case in the northern states and among the white people who attended Southern schools, who were segregated at that time. What Maria Gleamore and Audrey Merchland and I found was, if you create sort of a composite of those school educational variables, and if you apply that to health outcomes, and you look and see how that relates to these outcomes, we were able to include almost 20,000 people in this analysis and found that higher investment in elementary school at the county level and at the state level was associated with lower risk of cognitive impairment later in life. The effect was strongest in white people, especially white women. Just want you to note that the benefit of school quality was much lower among Black people in general, especially Black men. And we think that racism in schools and in the labor market served to counteract the benefits of quality schooling for Black Americans, especially for Black men. This study is Justina Avila Rieger, who is an alumna of University of New Mexico for graduate school, and she has been with us as a postdoc. She recently got a K-99, and for anybody who knows her, also she had a baby. So all good things. She did a study to address the mechanism of cognitive reserve, and using MRI data in the YCAP cohort along with neuropsychological test data, she looked at measures of neuropathology such as cortical thickness on the x-axis here, and measures of cognitive function. And this slide shows performance on a language composite score at baseline, which is up here, this first row, and over time, which is this bottom row. Basically, she found that in white people, folks with more education had high cognitive test scores even when they had cortical thinning. but this was not the case among the Black and Latinx participants. In other words, years of school did not have a uniform protective role against cognitive impairment. This cognitive reserve idea, it did not have a uniform protective role across racial and ethnic groups. So I'm just going to flash this up quickly just to give you a reference for some things that Maria Gleamore and I think might link education to brain health, and tell you that we're embarking on more research to try to break down, okay, what is it about these schools and what happens in school that protects the brain / protects cognition. And one of the resources that I'm using to do that is these studies that were established in schools, in high schools early on. So there's a Project Talent study that took place in 1960 that tested about 400,000 students. And in 2018, we went out and tried to find about 20,000 of them and follow up with them and give them cognitive tests. So we have directly measured data from their schools and from them because they did 2 days of testing. And then we followed up with them 57 years later to get their cognitive outcomes. We are now receiving data from the high school and beyond study where people were in high school in 1980 with a smaller sample size, but better follow-up. And then we just got a big grant. This is through the University of Texas at Austin. Chandra Muller is like a sociologist, sociology of education, who's been studying NLS 72, which are people who went to high school in 1972. So we're following up on all those people, trying to look more carefully at the link between school, whether it's peers, it could be something about the neighborhood. And we have direct measures of cognition when they were younger, which really helps rule out that there's something about the individual and not the schools that's causing this link. Let me show you some data from the Offspring study that talks about structural racism. Here is our sample. I mentioned that we have a lot of of Latinx people in the YCAP study. Their children are even obviously more diverse than they are, including the fact that almost 98% of the people who identify as Hispanic in the parent cohort want to be tested in Spanish, but that is not true among their kids. We have a good chunk of them who are much more comfortable in English. And so bilingualism is something that Miguel Arce Renteria, who's another one of my mentees, has now taken to a K99 R01, where he's looking at bilingualism in the Offspring cohort. A major dimension of heterogeneity in this cohort is self-identified country of origin. Most are Dominican, as I was saying, followed by Puerto Rican and Cuban. But that country of origin is distributed differently depending on the language of administration. And so what we decided to do was to measure exposure to discrimination using these different levels of exposure. We measured daily interpersonal racism using the everyday discrimination scale. And this shows that non-Hispanic Black participants who are in orange had the highest mean exposure to daily racism compared to Latinx in purple and white people who are in gray. And on average, Black participants experienced interpersonal discrimination at least once a week. And they're also more likely to attribute these experiences of discrimination to be related to their race, ancestry, or skin color than the Latinx and white people in our study. Similarly, we combined reports of occurrence and frequency on the major discrimination scale to measure institutional racism. And as the second bar chart is showing here, non-Hispanic Black people in our cohort reported experiencing almost 6 civil rights violations on average during their lifetime. We also measured a study or a measure of structural racism, which we are operationalizing as residential segregation during childhood. And we do that with their parents, the measures that we collected from their parents. At least half of the Black and Latinx participants lived in segregated neighborhoods during childhood. In contrast, only about 8% of the non-Hispanic white participants did so. So we used linear regression models that are adjusted for age and education to examine relationships between interpersonal racism and memory, and this is in the offspring. This plot shows beta estimates and confidence intervals for this relationship in the overall sample and for the racial and ethnic groups. And at the end here, I'm showing the relationship of 1 year of age to memory for comparison. We found reliable relationships between daily experiences of racism and memory in the whole sample. So the association of interpersonal racism to memory corresponds to 3 years of chronological age, and was driven by non-Hispanic Black participants. This plot has the same layout. This time I'm showing you institutional racism with delayed memory. There was a reliable relationship between institutional racism and memory scores among non-Hispanic Black participants, such that each reported civil rights violation corresponded to the effect of about 4.5 years of age on memory. And then finally, participants who lived in more racially and ethnically segregated neighborhoods when they grew up had lower delayed memory scores. This was true in the entire sample, but you can see that when we stratified the analyses by group, the relationships were imprecise. And finally, I'm going to show you an example of how we're leveraging our intergenerational design to understand life course systems of exposure to social and structural forces and their impacts on brain health. Justina and Indira created a composite measure of childhood SES using the information from the YCAP cohort. With our colleague Sabrina Samoes, we measured Alzheimer's disease biomarkers in the blood of our offspring participants. And we're looking at p-tau right now, concentration on the x-axis, and we're looking at memory score of the offspring on the y-axis. And what we found was that the childhood, someone's drawing some nice lines for me there, but the childhood socioeconomic status was a determinant of the relationship, or a buffer of that relationship between level of tau that we found in their blood and their memory test performance, so that people who, regardless of race, who had higher parental SES had a weaker relationship, or were able to sustain more tau in their system than were people who had lower socioeconomic status. And these graphs roughly show that thanks, Tim, for all the nice marks that you're making on my slides, but this shows that the relationship was the same across ethnic and racial groups. So let me finish. Take Tim's marks off and say that we have found that the most informative research on mechanisms of dementia disparities are not from convenience samples or clinic samples, but from population representative random samples. We have found evidence for fundamental structural and social causes of inequalities in dementia and cognitive aging, and that there's evidence that life course social factors, most of them patterned by structural racism, influence dementia risk and resilience, and that we've had a lot of success in including population feasible biomarkers like the ones I just showed you that are taken from the blood to determine the relative contribution of various sources of neurodegeneration to this. We've also seen that economic and social policies are brain health policies. So policies to repair intergenerational impact of racism and discrimination on wealth could also be brain health equity policies. Investment in schools and teachers in schools that serve Black and Latinx children will increase educational quality, and that will have an impact on brain health later in life, and funds to decrease inequalities in the neighborhood may also create brain health equity. Finally, I just want to say that we've experienced, and I think I've shown you some of their work, that critical leadership by scientists that have not traditionally been included in dementia research has really benefited our work and our field and our lab. So let me stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jen. That was a lot to digest. So much appreciated. We're going to open it up for questions. It looks like Dr. Mishra has a question.
I don't have a question, ma'am. I was just clapping.
Oh. All right.
I had a question. Will Wiley here. I'm one of the PG by course. You mentioned leadership by people who are not maybe underrepresented in the sciences, and I was it's just something I care a lot about, and I was curious if you could tell me a little more about it.
Okay. My lab is doing work on inequalities, and what this means, is that we're doing community-based work that really matters, I think, to people who are coming from underrepresented backgrounds. And so I get a lot of people at various career levels who want to work with us, and it's been not always easy, but we have programs that include high school students, that include undergrads, that include people who are in grad school and postdocs, and we try to make experiences for them that will be welcoming. And part of that is this lab meeting that is really a work in progress. We work a lot on helping people feel welcome in science, and even if they're sort of new to it. The other thing, and I flashed up this Black and Neuro organization, sort of an affinity organization for Black people in neurosciences. And we've realized that at any one program there may be just a few people, but they need sort of a group that spans different programs. And so we really advocate for people joining those. And so Black and Neuro is one resource that I think for folks who are on the call to look into. And then the other piece is just that it has to be an intentional work. We have to really be able to recognize the different places that people are coming from and welcome them in our group. So I guess that's what I would say to your question. We can get more specific, but it needs to go beyond critical. It needs to go beyond just one or two people in a lab. They become they often feel like tokens, and so there's a critical mass that's needed to feel welcome. And then I think their involvement goes beyond that instrumental involvement, which is like, oh, we have a person who speaks Spanish in our lab, now we can test Spanish speakers. No, it's about the intention coming from really the top level, that people with those backgrounds have a lot to contribute, and we have learned just as much from them in terms of the questions that they come up with than they learn from us. Was that okay, Will?
Yeah, that was perfect. And I actually just pulled up the Black and Neuro website so I can check it out. I really appreciate your answer.
Sure.
Jen, do you think that your obviously the topics you're studying, I could imagine would be of greater interest to Black and Latinx people, students, how big an influence is that in terms of, besides obviously the other things that you do, but in terms of recruiting these?
Yeah.
students?
I don't think I'll ever know, because I think that we have a lot of things going on that I think are signals to people that it's a safe place to go. What I can say, if you go on that Black and Neuro site, you'll see a lot of neuroscientists, and their work isn't explicitly about inequalities in health outcomes. They're really doing like basic science, and they are Black or Latinx themselves, and they also have labs that, many of them, labs that are full of people who identify that way as well. And so there's something I think about seeing someone who looks like you or may have had experiences like you in a leadership position. That's one thing, but that's not enough. I think the other piece is that we intentionally want to make a space that has a healthy, non-toxic, welcoming vibe for people. We talk about microaggressions a lot. We talk about some of these ideas, experiences. We link to articles. If people see an article about medical school as a racialized organization, we present that in lab meeting, sort of assign it to a group of people to kind of go over, and we have a conversation about it. And it's just really sort of, at the career level and at the science level, I think, sort of, prepping people for what they're gonna experience.
Yeah. Does anyone else have a question?
I see what Micaiah put in the chat, so thank you. If anybody wants to come and sit in our lab meeting, just email me. And I put my email on the first slide, and you can just Google me to find it. And I'll give you the link, and you can join us and see how it goes. We're having our last meeting of the year next week, but then we'll be restarting in January. Excellent.
Well, thank you so much. This is, as I said before, there's a lot to digest here. And I want to ask you a question. So what's next? But I think we got a bit of a flavor. You want us to comment about that? Where you're...
Sure. Well, I think, I mentioned those educational studies. So the studies that have the data from people who went to high school, and just the value of having those direct measurements. One of the papers we're working on right now is looking at what your peer sort of personality in terms of peer affects both in performance on tests and also their personality traits, how those peer effects relate to whether someone is at risk for cognitive impairment or not later on in their life. So it could be that schools are really just about who you go to school with and who you can network with, who you learn to network with, rather than your individual ability. So separating those two out. And then we're also excited about the plasma-based biomarkers, and I showed you some of that work now, that give us on a larger cohort people who may not have been able to come in to get MRI scans or to get a PET scan to be able to characterize their neuropathology.
Yeah. The other thing that I was particularly impressed by is that obviously you developed several cohorts that aren't impacted by the selection biases, or at least much impacted by the selection biases that most studies are. But you've also reached out to get data from other studies like Project Talent and whatever to answer some of the questions that you're interested in, and coupled with sophisticated statistical analyses and so on, you're answering a lot of questions in that way as well, which I think may be something that people would be interested in terms of being able to look at those issues from the hinterlands of New Mexico as well.
Absolutely. If anybody wants to collaborate about New Mexico-based data or, that type of data, just let me know.
Excellent. Well, thank
Okay.
you very much.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Yes.
Bye. Happy holidays.
Yeah, same to you.